In a pointed interview following a tense October meeting with the US president, he made clear that he does not regard the US leader as an adversary, even as concerns over Washington's shifting posture toward Russia have grown in Kyiv. He said the meeting had been normal and constructive, dismissing media reports of a volatile encounter. At the same time, he acknowledged frustration in Kyiv after the US leader declined to send long-range cruise missiles, a request Ukraine had made, instead urging diplomacy as the way ahead. He said, "I am not afraid of him." Those words carry weight in a war-torn country that remains heavily dependent on foreign aid and arms shipments for its defense. Behind the calm surface of that line lies a more complex reality: uneasy trust, strategic uncertainty, and the constant question of how far Washington will push Moscow versus how far it will push Kyiv. President Zelensky traveled to Washington in October 2025 for the first face-to-face meeting with President Trump since Trump entered office. The atmosphere was charged. Ukraine continues to fight for its survival against a war-hardened Russia. The US is simultaneously pressuring Moscow through sanctions, yet also signaling a narrower war objective and a potential shift in how it deals with Russia. Zelensky's visit came amid leaked reports of tension in the Oval Office, arms requests delayed, demands for Ukraine to make concessions, and US ambiguity about whether it will support Kyiv indefinitely or condition its support. In that context, Zelensky's remarks, asking why he should fear his powerful US counterpart, crack open an essential question: is Ukraine facing a reliable ally or a transactional partner? His answer was clear: he trusts no intimidation. He counts on no guarantee without clarity. The media characterized a portion of the Oval Office meeting as a rant by President Trump. According to accounts, Trump accused Zelensky of gambling with millions of lives. "You are gambling with World War III," during the discussion. Zelensky, for his part, refused to rebut that verbal flare-up directly, but he responded to insinuations that Ukraine bore some responsibility for the war by stating, "They started this war." His assertive posture underlines how Kyiv refuses to accept moral equivalence with Moscow. In recent weeks, President Trump has adopted a dual approach, ramping up sanctions on Russia's energy sector, while also making public remarks suggesting Ukraine must accept compromises in any peace deal, including potentially relinquishing territory. Ukraine's leadership views this with caution. Zelensky publicly warned that the tone coming from Washington is too warm toward Russia and that this will not stop the Kremlin's aggression. His message: Ukraine must be treated as the victim of aggression, not a party equally responsible. One of the undercurrents of the US policy has been energy trade. While Washington is imposing harsh sanctions on Russia's oil majors, Rosneft and Lukoil, it simultaneously granted a one-year exemption for Hungary's Russian oil and gas imports, citing Budapest's reliance on Moscow's supply. This tension does not escape Kyiv. The fact that Washington is both pressing Russia and yet offering relief to Moscow's energy trade partners raises strategic questions in Kyiv. Are US sanctions truly intended to isolate Russia or to influence its behavior? And can Ukraine rely on the US to push Moscow when the US appears to pick its battles? Zelensky's rhetorical question, "Why should I fear Trump?" implicitly responds, "I will fear abandonment, not a bully. Why should I fear Trump?" A provocative rhetorical line from Zelensky that sets the tone of his remarks. "I am not afraid of him." Asserting his independence, his confidence in Ukraine's stance, and his refusal to be cowed. They started this war. A direct statement pointing the finger at Russia, contrasting with narratives of shared blame. By preserving these, the script keeps Zelensky's voice central while contextualizing them within the broader geopolitical frame. From Kyiv's vantage point, the stakes are existential. Ukrainian forces remain battered after more than 3 years of grinding conflict. Aid from the West has been vital for both survival and defense. Yet Ukraine also knows it cannot be an indefinite ward of external powers. It must assert agency. Zelensky repeatedly emphasizes, when Ukraine speaks of peace, everything except surrender. His public tone mixes defiance with diplomacy. Ukraine is open to negotiations, but not ready to compromise its sovereignty or accept an imposed freeze without guarantees. For the United States, the war in Ukraine presents multiple challenges: balancing global commitments, energy and trade policy, NATO alliances, and domestic priorities. President Trump's approach appears to reflect a desire to curb US commitment while claiming a leadership role, though the actual strategy remains murky. The US Treasury sanctions on Russia's oil industry mark an escalation. Yet the granting of exemptions and selective relief suggests flexibility or perhaps pragmatism, which some in Kyiv interpret as hedging. How Washington defines a victory or a settlement in Ukraine affects not only Kyiv, but also allied countries in Europe, Asia, and further beyond. Zelenskyy's visit in context signals three fronts for Ukraine: secure, credible, long-term US military and security commitments, not just short-term arms shipments; avoid being forced into a peace deal that bypasses Ukraine's voice or imposes strategic concessions without compensation; manage relations not only with Russia, but also with the US that may be shifting its focus or tactics. On the US side, the questions include: how much pressure will Washington maintain on Russia's war machine? What cost is it willing to bear, economically, militarily, diplomatically? How will it reconcile its energy and trade policy with its strategic goals in Europe? For Ukraine, Zelenskyy's line, "I am not afraid of him," frames a posture of agency, but the reality remains that Ukraine depends heavily on the support and choices of others. In a world of shifting allegiances and complex energy geopolitical linkages, the simple sentiment, "Why should I fear Trump?" encapsulates Ukraine's broader concern: fear of abandonment, fear of being the plaything of bigger powers, rather than fear of a particular leader's rhetoric. Zelenskyy may be confident publicly, but his remarks also carry an urgency. He must signal to Washington that Ukraine will not play a passive role, that its survival depends on clear lines, not just vague assurances. At the same time, he must remind Europe and the United States that Ukraine is not bargaining chip, but a frontline state. As this war grinds on, the most important question may not be whether Ukraine fears the US president, but whether the US still fears letting Ukraine fall. The answer to that may determine the course of the next phase of the war, the shape of any peace deal, and the future of Europe's eastern frontier.